Get Rich Education is brought to you by Ridge Lending Group, Mid-South Homebuyers, and GRETurnkey.com.
Welcome to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold, giving you information and ideas on the investment that has turned more ordinary people into millionaires and billionaires than anything else, and can provide you with more wealth and happiness than you ever thought possible. Now, here's your host, investor, entrepreneur, business owner, and educator, Keith Weinhold.
Welcome to GRE, Get Rich Education, episode 159. I'm Keith Weinhold, and today we're building your wealth as I'm going to give you some of my best negotiation techniques, especially those for real estate investing. And in a few minutes, we're going to have the founder of the American Negotiation Institute here with us. He's a really sharp guy, and I'll see what he thinks about some of my real estate negotiation techniques. Now, as you know, I'm not a big believer in you being your own landlord over the long term because that's just not a very scalable proposition for you, and it's a tough job. Let your property manager take care of that stuff. But if you do find yourself in a position of having a tenant that doesn't want to pay your rent by the due date, we're going to go ahead and dampen this potential conflict before it flares up, okay? Here's exactly what you do. Nip this problem in the bud. Don't let the tenant pay you the rent late unless you serve them with your state's notice form. In some states, that's called a notice to quit, or it's just a formal notice informing your tenant that they are indeed late with the rent. That gets recorded. In case you communicate with the tenant a little bit outside of what's on that form, here is a great negotiation tactic that I know of for you to get the rent paid and for them to still respect you, or at least greatly increase the chances that the rent's going to get paid. What you tell the tenant about the fact that you're giving them official notice that the rent is due is this, and you know what? It's just 7 little words. The law says that I have to. Oh, you have just done so much with those 7 little words. The law says that I have to. You've demonstrated to your tenant that it's not personal. It's not about them, and it's not about you either. It's about the law. That right there builds a climate of non-animosity between the two of you. And you know what else it does? It demonstrates to the tenant that you follow the law and that you know the law. Being a property manager is tough. That is why I want you to outsource that task sooner rather than later. As a property manager, which I just sort of interchangeably call a landlord here, it's quite easy to either come down too hard on a tenant and upset them, or on the other hand, come down too easy on a tenant, and then you're just going to get walked all over. Giving them a basis for your action with a statement like the law says that I have to, that can really help you, especially if you say you live in one unit of an owner-occupied fourplex and your tenant is also your neighbor and you run into them sometimes. So give that technique a try. With that situation, yeah, there can be some conflict that you're trying to keep from bubbling over, but negotiation isn't always about conflict. I'll give you an example of how I negotiated the terms 5 years ago when my wife and I were buying the very home, the primary residence that we still live in today. So we toured the home with our buyer agent. We liked both the property and the neighborhood, and we wanted the home. The asking price was $470,000, $470,000. That price was affordable to us at the time, and I learned that the seller wanted to get the best price that he could. That's a common motivation. There's nothing wrong with that. By checking Zillow, I could see that the property had been on the market for a few months, and at one point I could even see in the Zillow history that they had reduced the ask price from $475,000 down to $470,000. The $470,000 was still just somewhat aggressively priced, and that's why it was still on the market. So here's what I told the seller, using our agents as intermediaries. Okay, I said, I'll give you your price if you give me my terms. And now it sounds quite reasonable to the other party when you present it that way. Okay, see, I know that the return from property equity is always zero. That's something that I've often discussed here on the show. So I only wanted to make a 5% down payment on the property, not 20%. That way, I'd have an extra $70,000 of cash that would stay in my pocket. $70K is the difference between a 20% down payment and a 5% down payment on a home of this price. But see, typically, with less than a 20% down payment, you've got to pay an annoying private mortgage insurance premium of several $100s a month. And I didn't want to pay that if I didn't have to. So I wrote the offer this way. The seller got his price, $470, but here were my terms. What we're going to do is pay the bank's upfront PMI premium of $7K, and we're going to do that with your $7,000, Mr. Seller. That way you'll still net a nice $463K, and by paying PMI upfront at closing for me, then the bank won't charge me PMI every month at all. And you know what? It worked. That was part of the, what I'll call the price or terms deal on the primary residence that my wife and I have been living in for over 5 years now. So effectively, I paid a purchase price of $7K more than the seller netted. But see, that extra $7,000 loan amount on my 30-year fixed mortgage meant that I was only going to pay about an extra $30 per month on my mortgage and avoid paying the PMI every month, which might have been $300 or $400. Now, one small risk with that is that I needed to get the appraisal of this somewhat aggressively priced home to hit $470,000, and it hit $470 exactly. Funny how that works. But that's the negotiation strategy that I call your price, my terms. Now, on that deal, the result for me is that I got a better primary residence. I was able to put only 5% equity in my primary residence, and I kept $70,000 freed up from being trapped in my non-income producing home. And that way, with $70K, you can go make 3 down payments on income producing turnkey properties rather than have it trapped in your home. So I'm basically kind of borrowing that $70K of equity out of the home just by keeping that $70K out of the home. And I pay less than a 4% interest rate on that, and then getting a terrific arbitrage upside by having it invested in 3 more turnkey properties, which can provide a fantastic rate of return when you consider the 5 ways that you're simultaneously paid with income property. How much would you invest in a vehicle that can never go up in value and only go down? Well, as little as you possibly could. And that's just what home equity is. Home equity is unsafe, illiquid, and its rate of return is always 0. So I might as well break up that equity and get it levered into as many different properties as I possibly can. So in that example that I gave, when some people find out how powerful passive income from real estate is, and they want to separate equity from their home, their primary residence, in order to do it, well, that can be good. But see, it's even better if you had never put any substantial equity into the home in the first place. So that your price and my terms negotiation is one that really didn't have any conflict in it. Let's talk some more about negotiation with today's guest, whom is a negotiation expert. In fact, he is the director of the American Negotiation Institute. He's giving a TED Talk called Finding Confidence in Conflict. You can look that up. Let's meet today's guest. Today's guest is a business lawyer, and he is the director of the American Negotiation Institute. It's a role where he serves as a negotiation consultant for attorneys and for companies closing large business deals. He also conducts live training sessions about negotiation for organizations. He also hosts a podcast called Negotiate Anything, where he interviews successful entrepreneurs and shares powerful persuasion techniques. With over 110,000 downloads and listeners in 140 countries, it is, in fact, the top-ranked negotiation and dispute resolution podcast in the nation. Welcome to Get Rich Education, Kwame Christian.
Keith, thank you for having me. And there's something important you missed out on my bio. The most impressive fact about the podcast is the fact that we have guests like Keith Weinhold joining us to give us amazing tips. So I think that's the best selling point.
Well, that's right. You can hear me over there with Kwame on his show. Kwame, negotiation is such I'll call it a highly transferable skill. It's a highly transferable generalist skill, both in business and really in everyday life, something you can use with your family and with your neighbors. But Let's talk a little bit about what negotiation is, because I think the very thought of negotiation stresses some people out. To them, they might define it as sort of polite arguing. But why don't you define negotiation for us?
And one of my goals in this episode is to try to disavow some people of their fears about negotiation and really empower them to engage in more negotiation, because there's a lot of value out there to be claimed. And so my definition of negotiation is anytime you're in a conversation where somebody in the conversation wants something. And when you use a definition like that, you can tell it's very broad. And my goal is to change the way you see negotiation, because one of the biggest barriers people have to effective negotiation is that they have very poor negotiation recognition. They don't know that they actually have an opportunity to negotiate. So improving your recognition is going to improve your ability to do it, because you'll recognize that now I have an opportunity to utilize these skills.
Yeah, now I would expect that we're negotiating several times every day, both inside and outside of business. My wife might ask me, so, hey, Keith, would you like to join me at the baby shower tomorrow? And I might feel like I'm in a position where I'm negotiating. I might want to not go to the baby shower so much because the NFL is on tomorrow and my team might be making the playoffs, but I know that she knows that I watched the NFL last week. So already I'm in a situation where I might be negotiating.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to keep in mind, too, that there are 3 goals of negotiation. The first goal is to use a negotiation offensively to get more of what you want. And then you could also use these negotiation skills defensively to avoid things you don't want. So saving money or avoiding baby showers is another good example. And then the third pillar of negotiation, and I think the most important pillar of negotiation, is strengthening relationships. So regardless of the outcome, you can always maximize pillar number 3, which is strengthening relationships. And when you see negotiation in this way, you see it as from an opportunity base. And so even in those annoying negotiations, because I'm married and I have to go to baby parties all the time. I have a 2-year-old too. His birthday party was yesterday. That was a fun party, but other kids' birthday parties, I'm not really feeling it. So I have those same negotiations. But as long as I keep those 3 pillars in mind, I know that even if I end up sitting at a 2-year-old birthday party that's not my own son, at least I can do it in a way that strengthens the relationship. And at least that way I can still glean some value from the interaction.
Well, let's talk about strengthening relationships, because after a negotiation, you want to keep that relationship intact. Some people are afraid that negotiating hard on their behalf means that the other party needs to lose something and that they might resent you and that the relationship might be diminished rather than strengthened. So how do you negotiate in a way so that both sides sort of get what they want and you can strengthen that relationship going forward, since strengthening relationships is one of those 3 pillars?
Absolutely. When you go into these conversations, you have to have a very clear understanding of what their needs are, what their psychological, emotional, and tangible needs are. And if you don't know what those things are, the first thing that you need to learn in the conversation is what those things are, because that is going to color the entire interaction with the person. And so you need to find creative ways to allow them to get what they need from the interaction while still getting what we need from the interaction.
Now, when you're out there, you've sort of got to leverage the resources of other people. I find myself in a position where I'm often managing the manager. I have property managers in various different markets inside and outside the United States managing my properties. But there can be times where, for example, here in one of my local apartment buildings, we're turning a unit over. So a contractor team needs to get in there and make a series of renovations. And I want the contractor and my manager managing that contractor to perform quickly and turn that unit over so we can get another tenant in there so I can go ahead and keep my vacancy down. But I don't really want to seem like I'm bugging them too often, but yet I want them to be motivated. I want them to finish the work for me. So number one, I can get a tenant in there sooner. And secondly, I can just go ahead and remove that whole thought from my mental bandwidth and go ahead and focus on things that I enjoy doing more. So there's kind of a motivation component to this. So how can I motivate somebody like my manager and my contractor in this case to sort of get this done for me sooner, but yet keep that relationship intact?
I think with this one, this dovetails perfectly in with what we were just talking about with understanding their psychological, emotional, and tangible needs. But on top of that, I'd add, we need to recognize one of the most important negotiations we have within any relationship, and that is the negotiation as to what the expectations are going to be for this engagement, for our relationship. So, for example, if you have a specific timeline that you want when it comes to getting these contractors to move quickly and so you can have less turnover, it's important for you to verbalize that and actually engage in the conversation with regard to that timeline, because you might have a number in mind, a number of days or weeks in mind, and they might have another one. And both of you could be completely reasonable with it, but it could be different. One of the issues that a lot of people have is that their negotiation strategy involves a lot of hope, or is entirely based on hope. And instead of actually engaging in the conversation, they just hope that the person does the right thing. It's a lot easier to prevent messes from happening than it is to clean up messes. So what I would say in these types of situations is, when you see the potential of discrepancy between the expectations, being proactive and heading it off at the pass and having this conversation. One of the things we need to be comfortable with is the word no or some resistance, because of their expectations. They might think a longer timeline is more appropriate, but now we need to expose that potential conflict, bring it to the surface, and have it at this time earlier on in the interaction to make sure that it is less damaging, because it's less damaging early on than it is later on. So what I would say in that case is, be proactive and be abundantly clear with what it is your goals are with regard to time, and then having that conversation and seeing where it goes.
One negotiation technique that's popular contends that what you should do is you should let the other party speak first. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and I would say I'm a rhetorical counterpuncher when it comes to negotiation. I like to be more, what seems to be more reactive, but really what I'm doing is controlling through the use of open-ended questions. So even though I'm speaking less, probably 30% of the conversation I'm speaking, I'm controlling the direction of the conversation. I would say you want the person to feel as though they're speaking first, but I'm directing them at least with a question. And so to your point, when you say let the other person speak first, something that goes along with that is the idea that you should always let the other person give the first offer as well. And I would say that this is a situation that's completely based on feel. And so my rule of thumb when it comes to offers is, when you have more information, you make the first offer. But if they have more information, that's when you let them speak first and let them make the first offer. Because if you're clear on where things are, then you can take the initiative and lead the conversation, because you know what your goal is and you know what the topography of the landscape is. So you can move forward with confidence. But the less you know, the less you speak, and the more you sit back and be more reactive. So I would say letting the other person speak first and make the first offer is going to be especially valuable in situations where you have less information. Because, again, thinking about opportunities to negotiate, if you're engaging in a negotiation and you're not entirely sure about the situation or the person, or you have some serious questions, the first goal of your negotiation is to get information. Before you get money, mortgages, or houses, your first goal in this particular negotiation needs to be to get information. And sitting back and allowing the person to speak and then following up with open-ended questions to get more information is going to be your number one goal during the conversation.
That's a good technique. In the first example I gave, we talked about how a timeline is important to me, more so time rather than money, in getting that unit renovated. When it comes to the negotiation paradigm of letting the other party speak first, I think that plays into something that I think of as midpoint negotiation. When you allow the other party to speak first, that allows you to define a midpoint when we're talking about negotiating for money primarily rather than time. So a lot of inexperienced negotiators, what they end up doing is they find themselves splitting the difference in their negotiations. I think most people are familiar with that. For example, if one inexperienced negotiator starts by speaking first and asking for $200 in this negotiation, and then another negotiator, say me, starts by offering $100 as a counter to that, well, the negotiation result generally ends up somewhere around $150, hence the midpoint. So this is kind of human nature to not want to give more or less than you're getting. So people tend to increase or decrease their offers by the same amount as the other party. But when the other party states their position first, then you have the ability to define the midpoint of the negotiation yourself. So in that example, if the seller had stated $200 first, well, then the buyer, let's just say me, could offer $60, and thereby I've reduced the midpoint of the negotiation down to $130 because I'd let the other person speak first, and that gives me more of an ability to define the midpoint. So that's one advantage of letting the other party speak first. What are your thoughts about that midpoint paradigm?
It's a really great point. I think that's really important to keep in mind when you do come up with your counter proposal if you've allowed the other person to make the first proposal. And what's important is when you are setting the midpoint by your counter, what you need to do is you need to make sure that you justify every single offer that you make with objective, legitimate criteria. And so when I say objective, what I mean is I want to utilize something that legitimizes what I just said that is clearly not something that I came up with. This is not Kwame saying this. This is, Forbes saying this. This is the Wall Street Journal saying this. This is a market analysis from a third-party company. And the reason we want to use objective criteria from third parties is because those are typically unassailable of sources of legitimacy. It's easy to say, yeah, of course you're saying that, Kwame. You're Kwame, and you're on your side. But Forbes has no stake in the race. This objective market analysis doesn't either. So whenever you make a counter or make any kind of offer, make sure that it passes what I like to call the because test. And so you want to be able to finish this statement of, I think we should settle on $60 because, or I think this house is worth $200,000 because. And if you can fill that up at the end, if you can answer that because, then you have a legitimate statement. And then to your point too, if let's say you're the person who takes the first step in the negotiation and makes the first offer, this gives you an opportunity to anchor. But when it comes to the psychological principle of anchoring, you can change the person's perspective on where they would have initially made their offer based on how aggressive you are with your first offer. So you want to come up with the most aggressive offer that you can legitimately, objectively justify. That's where anchoring comes in.
That is a really great point. Basically, go ahead and provide some basis for the number that I'm putting out there. So if you combine anchoring and this sort of reasonable, non-biased basis along with the let the other party speak first mantra, really give yourself a chance for success. If I also have that basis, I really sort of anchor their thoughts closer to that 60 potentially than that 200.
Absolutely. Now I'm starting to get excited, as you could probably tell. The thing that I love about this is that all of this is rooted in psychology. That's my academic base. My undergrad was in psych before I got my law degree and master's. And so when it comes to these principles, as humans, we are hopelessly persuadable by these types of techniques. So here's an example. They did this study where people were standing in line to make a copy back in the day when you had to stand in line to make copies.
Right.
And so they asked people, hey, can I cut in line to make this copy? And so that worked maybe about 40 or 50% of the time. And then they had the person come up, same situation, and ask the same question, but add the word because. And the reason was terrible. They said, can I cut in line because I need to make some copies? And the percentage of success went above 90% just because they used the word because. So imagine how much more persuasive what you say will be when you actually have something with a little bit more substance behind the because. So don't underestimate the power of because in these conversations.
That's interesting. Even though the substantiation is just for the most obvious reason, you're all in line to make copies, just because the word because was used, that perhaps created some sort of anchor or some sort of potentially rational basis for cutting the line.
Exactly.
You're listening to Get Rich Education. Our guest is the American Negotiation Institute's Kwame Christian. More negotiation techniques when we come back. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Cash flow real estate investors, if you're looking for a mortgage loan with a company that specializes in investment property loans, it's Ridge Lending Group. They provide income property loans in almost every U.S. state. Ridge has worked with tens of thousands of investors and homeowners all over the country. In fact, with ethics and transparency, they've helped more people realize their dreams through real estate investing than any other mortgage lender in the country. Get started at ridgelendinggroup.com.
This is America's Money Answers man, Jordan Goodman. You're listening to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold. And don't quit your daydream.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. We're talking with Kwame Christian. He's the director of the American Negotiation Institute. We're talking about negotiation tactics in real estate investing, and really a lot of these techniques just carry over onto everyday life. People will pay what something is worth to them, and different services and different goods are worth different prices to different people. So, Kwame, do you have an example for how someone can go in with the psychology of thinking about how something might be worth more or less to them than it is for somebody else? So therefore, perhaps their own price should be different for them than it is for somebody else.
Yeah, for sure. And this is where, again, the psychology comes into it, because we really need to take the time and take an inventory of the kind of psychographics and emotional status of the person with whom we're negotiating, because those things, even though they are intangible, really have a tangible impact on their perspective of value. And so here's an example. My wife and I, when we were in, I think, undergrad, or when she was in med school and I was in law school, we had these old pots and pans, and we just wanted to get rid of them. We got some new ones. Oh, yes, because we just got married. And so we're like, okay, we can get rid of this stuff. And so I'm a big fan of Craigslist. It's a lot of fun for me to play around on that site. So I just posted these pots and pans, a box full of them, on Craigslist for, give me your best offer. And so somebody made an offer for $40 for these pots and pans. And we were shocked. We're like, okay, sure, take them. This lady came and she got the pots and pans. She was super excited about it. And she's like, yeah, my daughter's going off to college and this will be perfect for her. And as she was driving away, my wife told me, she's like, Kwame, I feel kind of bad about that. Those pans were not that great. I don't know. I just feel uneasy. And I said, Whitney, we showed her the pictures. She came here and she looked at the pans. And the thing is, even though we valued those pots and pans very low dollar value, they were much more valuable for her given her situation. And the true value is what somebody's willing to pay for it.
Right.
And considering those types of things, it kind of changes your perspective on what value is, especially when it comes to big purchases like real estate.
There might be some cases, though, where you've got a sentimental attachment to an object, whereas you might not sell it for a price if it were just given some sort of utilitarian role in society. So how does it work with an item like that?
So items that we currently own are valued higher to us than items that we don't own. So there was a great study, and I'm going to flub the numbers on this, but I'm going to get the essence of it right. So just a disclaimer there. So they had these students, they had a cup of coffee, and they said, hey, this is a cup of coffee. What would you pay for this? And so let's say the average price was $2. And so then they gave students a cup of coffee. And so now they feel like it's theirs. And they say, hey, this is your cup of coffee. How much should I pay you for that? And they would say something like $3.50, a significant difference. And just the fact that we own something, that gives it an extra bit of value. And that's not even sentimental. This is just a cup of coffee. When you add the sentimental value to that, it'll go up even more. And then if you add the concept of sunk costs, where people have invested into this thing, let's go ahead and say it's property, they're going to want to recoup for those sunk costs. And they're going to try and hold out to make sure that the investment that they made was not in vain, because people don't want to feel like they're wrong. And so when it comes to assigning value and trying to find the true value of properties and things like that, simply doing the appraisal is a good base and a good source of legitimate objective criteria. But you have to understand these different emotional and psychological things that are going to be tugging on that number in one direction or another.
A lot of people that want to sell their home fall into this problem right here. They have sentiment tied up in their home, and they might also have, say, a $500,000 home where they recently put $25,000 into kitchen counter upgrades with some nice quartz kitchen counters, and they think they can get $525,000 for the home, and the seller's agent have to have a pretty difficult conversation because it's usually not going to sell for that much more. So yes, people think about their sentiment and their sunk costs into a property, and you just can't necessarily think that way. We are in a real estate seller's market where the sellers typically have the advantage, and there is a greater demand for homes than there is a supply of homes in a lot of these markets. So kind of with that in mind, as a buyer or as a seller, when you're looking at price, should you ask for more than you expect if you're selling something, or only ask for exactly what you want?
I would always say ask for more than what you expect, but as much as you can legitimately justify. Because you're in a seller's market, you have a little bit more flexibility with it. You have the luxury of testing it. Whereas if a buyer were to do the same thing and anchor really low, and it's a house that you really like, since it's a seller's market, you're almost a commodity. You're not just negotiating. There's almost an element of game theory on the side of the buyer, which makes it a little bit more complex. And so you have to understand leverage. The seller in this case, because they have more options, they have more leverage. And because of that, they can be more aggressive. But the buyer in a seller's market needs to be a little bit safer because they don't have as much leverage, because they have fewer options. And so when it comes to understanding power and power dynamics and leverage in negotiation, one of the best ways to do that analysis, to conduct that analysis, is through an analysis of options. And typically the person or organization that has the most options is the person or organization with the most power.
So if I'm a buyer in a seller's market, can it be more an advantage rather than to make one offer, go ahead and provide that seller with 3 different options, 3 different prices, and go ahead and try to get a property that way?
3 different prices for the same property?
Yeah, 3 different prices for the same property. Maybe I'll give you a higher price if we can close faster, for example.
Absolutely. And this is a technique called log rolling. And so with this, what you do is you bring a full package offer with multiple options. And so you roll those packages up into one lump sum offer. So 3 different lump sum offers. And so what you're doing here is you don't even need to say, which one do you choose? You could preface the conversation by saying, which one do you like more? And remember, negotiation is an information game. What we're doing here is we're getting more information. And if we see that they say, hey, we like option B more than A and C, and with option B, there's a lower price but a faster closing date, now they have just given us clear signal that time is an important factor to them. And now that's information that you have that most others don't. And so that is a really smart way to ferret out some more information that can give you a better position to have a well-informed offer. And so especially in a very competitive market, that is exactly the type of information you need.
If successful negotiation is finding out what the other side wants, you might be able to get to the bottom faster with offer of 3 different options. Well, Kwame, I have one strategy out there that I've practiced, and it's something that's called the sort of always get the last concession thought. And that is, for example, let's say that I'm renovating a property and the renovation's nearly done, but there's just a big mess in the front yard and they've got a few of the big dumpsters over there, and we've really got to clean up that yard to make it presentable before we get it ready for tenants. So when you're negotiating with that cleanup contractor, let's say he throws out a final price and you end up both agreeing on that final price. So the price is done. But instead of me saying, okay, I agree with your price, we've got a deal, instead I'll say something like, I agree with that price if you can start first thing tomorrow morning, okay? And then maybe he'll come back with, well, I can't really start tomorrow, but how about I start the following day on Tuesday? And then my response could be, well, yeah, that might work, but then you need to finish in 2 days instead of 3. So as long as he counters your request, continue to ask for additional concessions. And eventually you kind of train that other party by giving a bit of resistance. So they're basically encouraging you to ask for more and more. And they also learn that by just giving in, they're going to end up giving up less in the end. And it should be obvious how this is going to help future negotiations with this person. So that's kind of what I call always get the last concession. What do you think?
I love that. That's really cool. I've never heard it described in that way. But yeah, I think that's a brilliant way to do that. And the thing is, too, the thing that it makes it especially brilliant is, Keith, you're anchoring, too.
Right.
Because let's say the numbers are already done. It's like, I want you first thing tomorrow. That's the best case scenario for you, and you can legitimately justify that. Maybe he would have offered beginning next week, but then his counter now might say, all right, well, what about Thursday? And if this is a Monday? And so you've already psychologically brought him closer to where you want to go. And I think that's a really great way to do that. And the concept of nibbling is similar, and that's where you have a deal set, but you ask for more after everything has been done. And so what you're doing is like a more socially acceptable version of nibbling, because nibbling is like the deal is set and then you like right when people are about to sign, you say, actually, I want this. And so just because they've invested so much, they feel that the pressure of sunk costs, they are unwilling or they've experienced too much war weariness to the point where they're not going to fight you. They'll just give it to you. But yeah, this is different because you're saying, I'll agree to that if. That is a much better way to do it. So much better. Now, just for the sake of addressing it, if you are on the receiving end of somebody who's nibbling, somebody who has, after the consummation of a full contract, is asking for more on top of the complete agreement, what you do is you say, oh, I wasn't aware that this was something that was so important to you. If that is the case, then we can open this whole deal back up and renegotiate everything, including that. And typically when people see that you're willing to kind of not blow up the deal, but say, listen, I'm not playing this game. I see what you're trying to do here. They would say, actually, never mind. Let's just stick with the deal we already have. But like I said, Keith, doing it the way that you did it before the entire deal has been executed, I think that's a brilliant way to do it. And it would result in a lot less animosity coming from the other side.
What about introverts? To a person that's introverted, they might feel like, I just don't know that I feel comfortable about negotiation. The whole thought of it kind of makes me sick to my stomach. What would you tell an introvert?
I would say that introverts, because of their natural tendencies, they might actually be better positioned to be high-level negotiators than extroverts. I have an episode talking about how negotiation should go for introverts and how you could use your natural predilections to be an effective negotiator. And really, like I said earlier, your willingness to listen and be more pensive allows more space for the person to speak. And so I'm naturally more of an introvert than an extrovert. That's why it's easier for me to maintain that breakdown of communication 70-30, where I'm only speaking 30% of the time. Because doing this allows me to control the conversation while giving the person an opportunity to feel like they're controlling it. Here's an example. Keith, you're an awesome interviewer. Who's controlling this conversation?
It's the interviewer. It's the one asking the questions, not answering them.
Exactly. So I'm talking all the time, but I am only going where you want me to go.
Exactly.
And when it comes to persuasion, if you take the time to prepare beforehand and ask really thoughtful questions and sequence those questions well enough, you can create a persuasive atmosphere that allows the person to convince themselves by answering the questions. So as an introvert, if there are any introverts out there who are listening, I would say don't feel like you need to change your natural tendencies to fit what the media has made you believe is what an expert negotiator is. We have all these shows who have people speaking so eloquently and knowing exactly what to say. That's really not how it goes in the real world. If there was a show on people who negotiate well, it would not be very successful, because they'd probably think it's pretty boring. It's everybody sitting down, being polite, asking questions. Who wants to see that? Where's the conflict there? So whatever it is, whatever your natural tendencies are when it comes to communication and human interaction, you really need to lean into that, because authenticity in and of itself is persuasive. And so you need to be you, because if you try to be somebody else in a negotiation, people will sense that something is off. They won't know exactly what it is. And it might come off as deception or something like that. And so you don't want to send off those type of warning signals. So just be yourself and ask a lot of questions, and you could be the perfect introvert negotiator.
I think the good news for introverts, too, is that negotiation is learned. Negotiation is not God-given. It's not a talent. It's a skill. It's something you can learn.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I loved so much about it. And so for me, when I discovered negotiation, it was by accident in law school. We had a negotiation course, and I took it only because it fit in my schedule, and I fell in love with it. And so they had this negotiation competition. And so my school has the top-ranked negotiation program in the country. And so they had a competition, and I was like, hey, me and my friend, we're going to try it out. And because I was so fascinated by the topic, even though I only had one course in it, and that course was just a week long, my friend and I, we were able to win the competition at the school, and there was about 50 other teams that participated. And then we got to represent our team in regionals in Ottawa, Ontario for the American Bar Association regional negotiation competition, and we won that. And then we made it to the semifinals of nationals in New Orleans. And the only reason I did it wasn't because I had some kind of innate skill. It was because of my intellectual curiosity. It just compelled me to outwork the competition. And that's really what does it. So when it comes to negotiation, preparation is where it's at. And if you take the time to prepare, you're going to be light years ahead of everybody else. And if you take the time to take advantage of these resources like fantastic books or maybe a podcast, shameless plug, your skills can grow exponentially just because of your willingness to work.
Well, yeah, a lot of that probably starts with you being a good listener as well. So, well, Kwame, as we're kind of winding down here, is there like something actionable that we can practice in the next 24 hours to be a better negotiator?
Absolutely. I have a challenge for your audience. And so with this challenge, it's called rejection therapy. And this is why I think this is so powerful. One of the biggest barriers to effective negotiation is the lack of ability or confidence in asking for what you want. And that comes from a fear of rejection. And as humans, back in the day, taking an evolutionary psychology perspective on this, we were social animals. If we became isolated from the pack, we would die for sure. And so because of that, we've become incredibly sensitive to rejection. And now when it comes to the business world, that rejection comes in the form of failure. And so that's why we're afraid of asking for what we want. But there's a way to get over that. Just like any other phobia, there's a psychological technique called flooding. With flooding, what you do is you hyperexpose yourself to the stimulus that scares you. And so with rejection therapy, you're going to hyperexpose yourself to rejection. Here's what I do. I take the opportunity to ask for things that I know I have no right at all to get with the hope of getting rejected. So for instance, if I go to a coffee shop and I'm with my friend and I get a pastry and maybe my friend's getting coffee, I just say, hey, my friend's here with me, that he didn't get a pastry. Can he get a pastry for free? Something like that. I have no right for that. You would be shocked. Absolutely shocked at how often it works and I get something. I remember one time I did that and on the coupon, it came up as miscellaneous discount. They have the authority to do that, but it's a win-win situation because let's say I do this and then I get what I want, what I ask for. That is a pleasant surprise. Like, wow, that's great. But then let's say I get rejected. They say, no, Kwame, you can't have that. I feel that little sting. And then a few minutes later, I realize, hey, I'm still here. I'm still alive. And by doing this and engaging in this practice, it makes you more resilient and it makes you more likely to be bold in the conversations when it really matters. And so that's why engaging in rejection therapy is probably one of the most powerful things you can do to increase your confidence as a negotiator.
Rejection therapy. All right, everybody, you got to get into therapy, apparently. So that's a good tip. Get used to getting the no, maybe even look for the no to sort of harden yourself somewhat over time. So, Kwame, what's a great way for our audience to get more familiar with you?
Yeah, the first way, as a podcast aficionados, I think the best thing you could do is to check me out on the podcast. It's called Negotiate Anything. So we don't just talk about the business principles and business applications for negotiation. I've also found that, the audience has told me that they like to hear about how you could use these negotiation and conflict resolution principles in all aspects of your life. So having people come in and talk about how they use it in their personal lives, with relationships, in different business settings. And what we do with our guests often is we have what's called a sparring session. So after the people come on and talk about their skills, I act like the manifestation of your worst nightmare. And the guest shows you how to deal with a difficult person utilizing these skills. And then the next thing that they can do is download this free guide. It's a 19-page ultimate negotiation guide. Really, I guess at 19 pages, you're more like an ebook. So it's a free ebook, whatever it is. And so it'll teach you how to be more confident in your negotiations and show you the 3 characteristics of effective negotiators. And it also includes our 3 most powerful and most popular free guides, negotiation guides that you can actually use to prepare for your next negotiations. So we have the negotiation preparation guide, the conflict resolution guide, and the salary negotiation guide. So if you go to AmericanNegotiationInstitute.com/guide, GUIDE, you can get that free guide.
Kwame Christian, thank you for that. It's been great having you on Get Rich Education today.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, yeah, and I agree with Kwame there. I don't agree with nibbling. After a deal is already agreed upon, it is done, and your word and your reputation are paramount. So, yeah, a lot of psychology and even emotion can go into negotiation. Sometimes there's situations you're in where you can tell that people just want to feel like their ego got stroked. And if they feel like they won, and if they feel like they beat you in the negotiation ego-wise, then they're good with almost whatever price or term. When I think about emotions, I think about this lake house in my life. It's the home that my wife and I ended up buying before the one that we live in now. We were willing to pay more than any other buyer for that home because it had this terrific, panoramic, unobstructed view of an Alaskan lake. Well, how do you put a price on that view? And how does an appraiser put a valuation on what a pristine lake view is worth to a certain person? That is a feeling, and that's where you get into shades of gray. And really, the more life experience that you get, you learn that life is not as black and white as you used to think, and almost everything that you deal with is a different shade of gray, which is exactly why negotiation is so important. There's another negotiating strategy that I learned about from another real estate kind of guy, and it has to do with you getting a better hotel room. When you're at the check-in desk, once you've arrived at the hotel with your spouse or whatever, what you ask of the hotel staff is, you know what, do you think that you could do something for us? We're from Anchorage, Alaska. This is the first time that we've ever been here in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Do you think that you could possibly give us a larger room with a great view for the same price? That would be really special to us. Say that right there. You would not believe how often that works. You gave them a reason, a basis for asking for the upgrade, like you've never been in that city before, something like that. And you know what? No one has to lose in that negotiation because a lot of times that nicer hotel room was going to go vacant for the night anyway. So just ask. Well, hey, I want to give special thanks to Kwame Christian today. We just met for the first time in person 2 months ago in Anaheim, California. He's got a great ability to negotiate and resolve conflict. His resources are in the show notes. I look forward to meeting some of our listeners in person for the first time this week, as tomorrow night I'll be arriving in New Orleans for the New Orleans Investment Conference. I know a lot of you are going to be there. As for some upcoming shows here, we're going to have both some decorated names that you're familiar with and some new guests. A longtime anchorman on Fox that actually hosted the #1 cable news show in the entire nation is going to be here with us to tell us about his real estate investing philosophy, because he was able to recently leave Fox since he's a full-time real estate investor now. We've also got a Rich Dad advisor returning. Also, we're going to have the principal of a turnkey real estate investing company here, and this company has sold more properties to GRE listeners than anyone else ever. So we're going to hear about why they're so successful with creating passive cash flow for you. Until next week, you know, one thing I'd really appreciate if you just simply told a friend about Get Rich Education. That's it. Whether you use the share button on your podcatcher to share this negotiation episode with a friend, or you just tell a friend or coworker about how Get Rich Education improves your life and tells everyday people about how to build wealth passively every week, I would really appreciate just simply that. Either way, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold, and I'll be back next week to help you build your wealth. Don't quit your daydream.
You've been listening to Get Rich Education, telling you what the wealthy won't tell you about real estate and investing.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.